Okay, so it's a great pleasure to talk to Bridget Kendall. I'd heard about your father, Bridget, as a well-known, distinguished statistician, and I'd heard that you were the first female master of Peterhouse. And of course, I listened to your broadcasts, and they're being rebroadcast, so I heard your voice yesterday, I think, on the BBC, talking about Russia. I always start with the question of when and where you were born.
I was born in Cumnor Hill, Oxford. My father was then at Magdalen College, Oxford, and we lived on Cumnor Hill, and I was born at home. And when I lived there till I was...
What year was that?
1956.
1956.
Yeah. So I had an older brother, and then 4 more arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And in, I think it was 1962, my father got the chair in mathematical statistics here at Cambridge, and we moved to Cambridge when I was 6.
Right. So I know Cumnor Hill. I lived in Cumnor Hill, among other things, when I was very small. Probably no earlier than that. But tell me something about your ancestors. Sir John Gurdon went back to the Norman conquest, but not everyone does. William Waldegrave did too, I think. Most people start at their grandparents. Or...
Yes. So my father was interested in genealogy, partly as a statistician. I've still kept all his papers, actually, even though lots of the information you could now get online, but I think the way in the pre-digital age that he tracked genealogy is in itself quite interesting. But so I know a bit more about my ancestry than some people. Both my parents are from Yorkshire, from North Yorkshire. In fact, they were from within 20 miles of each other. My father was born in Ripon, and my mother was from Thirsk, from a farming family in Thirsk, whose vet, incidentally, was James Herriot.
Really?
And my father's parents, his father had a clothing shop in Ripon, his mother, she came from a family from Whitby. She went to St Hilda's School in Whitby, and her antecedents were sailors and fishermen and farming folk. And we know that they came from 2 villages up the coast, Hinderwell and Staithes. Staithes is quite well known, it's very beautiful. It's where Captain Cook started out. So that bit of the family, they had a rather unusual family name, which was Trattles, so that was very easy to track. My mother's side, as I said, were farming, though there was one branch of the family, I think her grandmother's father and grandfather, they were making steel in Sheffield. So I think maybe that was the money that allowed them to buy the farm. So that's a bit of a picture. So nothing academic. My parents were both the first generation to go to university. They both went to Oxford, which is where they met. And prior to that, they were,
What about your grandparents? Did you know them?
Yeah, well, I knew my father's parents. So, yes, my grandfather, who was a shopkeeper, he was at Ripon Grammar School, like my father and his father. My grandmother, I knew, she had to leave school quite early. She was the eldest of 6, and I think just after the First World War, her father sent her off. So she finished school, I guess, at about 16, and went off to be a governess, and then a dental assistant, and then she met her husband. But her youngest sister, who was 6 years younger, and the youngest in the family, she had a better educational outcome because there was more money by then, and she went off to study botany at Durham University. So the 2 sisters had quite different educational paths by virtue of where they were in the family. I'm not sure their brothers went to university, but she was a very bright spark, my grandmother, and my father had glandular fever when he was about 6 or 7, and was educated at home for a couple of years by her. And then, as I say, he went to Ripon Grammar School. I went back to give a speech there not long ago. They asked me to do the speech day. And his name was everywhere. I hadn't realised he was head boy. And they were very proud of him because he got a Hastings scholarship to the Queen's College, Oxford.
As my uncle did.
Yeah.
From Sedbergh.
Yeah, yeah. And he did very well at school, and his maths teacher was a big influence on him, giving him tripos papers from Cambridge when he was quite a young teenager. He was clear, I think, from early on that he was going to be a very gifted mathematician.
Yeah. So moving on to your parents, and particularly their character and how they influenced you, can you tell us something about
So
that?
my father was quite a quiet man, even shy, but had a fantastic sense of humour. He was wonderful when we were small children. He was always making up nonsense rhymes and jokes, and I still repeat them now sometimes to my nephews and nieces, little songs. My mother was a sort of fiercer character, really. She had 6 children in 6 years, and she ran the family home. He would go off and do his mathematics, and she looked after all of us. And I mean, in those days, of course, children had much more freedom than they do now. So my older brother and I, after we moved to Cambridge, we would go off on the weekend on our bicycles in the morning, and as long as we were back for lunchtime, no one asked where we'd been. You wouldn't have that happen now. But she was quite sort of firm. I mean, I think being the eldest children in a family of lots of small children, you know, we were required to do the washing up, and if we went somewhere, we always had to be on the outside to hold the hands of the smaller children.
You were living in Oxford?
Well, we lived in Oxford till I was 6. In fact, I went to school when I was very young. I was only 2.5, and there was a dame school. Remember dame schools down the road in Cumnor Hill, run by Mrs. Miriam Walker, she was called, and she called the school Pooks because it was the top of Cumnor Hill, so it was like Puck of Pooks Hill. And my brother was already there, and my mother was expecting another child, so she had me go early. So I learnt to read before I was 3 because of this school. And then went on to the Oxford High kindergarten for, my brother was at the Dragon. And then we came to Cambridge when I was 6. And I went to a state school for a year in Trumpington, the Fawcett School, which was a huge shock, actually. It's quite a rough area in those days. And I lived in this rarefied world of almost personal tuition at a Dane school, and then the Oxford High School was, you know, pretty academics kids. And the Fawcett was another world. But I was only there for a year, and then went to the Pascal's junior school, which was back to a more academic environment. And that's where I did the rest of my education.
Let's go back a stage. I often ask people what their first serious memory was, concrete memory. Not just sort of things waving in the distance from their pram, but something they really think they remember, or maybe have been told they remember.
I don't know. I do remember odd things at Cumnor Hill. I remember playing on the porch and my father arriving home with a little packet of dolly mixture for my dolls.
How old were you then, do you think?
I don't know, 3, maybe. I remember going on holiday. We used to go on holiday to the Gower in Wales, and I had a lovely stone with swirls, like eyes. I still got it, which I called Blinky. And we were out on the beach for a walk, and I lost it, as the way a small child does. And my dear father went and scoured the beach until he found it again. So, what else do I remember? I remember the youngest, well, that would be later, because I was 5 when the twins were born. So there were 4 of us, and then my mother had twins. And I do remember a lot of small children crying all at the same time. I remember being put on the train in Oxford by my father, who said to the guard, "Now look after her, and her grandparents will meet her in York," and went all the way to York to stay with my grandparents and mine. I'd probably be 4, maybe
On
5.
your own?
Yeah. And arriving at York Station, it was April, and if you know York Station, you'll know you come out and see the city walls covered in daffodils.
Lovely.
Which they still are. Yeah. So those are some early memories.
Lovely, yes. At that age, say 3 to 6 or 7, did you have any particular hobbies or interests or passions?
No, I was that small. I always liked to draw. I used to draw a lot. And carried on doing that right the way through my teens. I did art A-level. So that was one thing. I do remember, I think I was probably about 3, and we were in Oxford, and probably just my father, because there were all these other children, so my parents didn't always do things together, took me to the ballet, which was, my memory was that it was in St Giles. I don't know how they managed it. Maybe there was a big marquee there, in Swan Lake. And I remember coming out and saying, I want to do that. As a small child would, a small girl anyway. And I did do ballet lessons, actually. When we moved to Cambridge, my younger sister and I went every Saturday morning to the Church Hall of St Columbus on Regent Street, where there was a very exotic Russian ballet instructor,
I remember.
Madame Nina.
Yes, I remember her.
Do you remember her? She used to wear a watch on both hands, and she taught us the way she'd been taught in Moscow, which is very strict. Lots of bar work, getting your hands right, all the positions. Yeah.
A friend of mine went to those at that time, the secretary of the Art and Dance faculty, I think. So she used to tell me about her.
Yes.
I knew about her. Up to the purse, were there any teachers who you remember and influenced you at all?
Well, there was Miriam Walker at this first school. She got in touch with me years later, actually. So roll forward to 1983. I'd been with the BBC World Service a short while, and I was kind of selected to join Newsnight, to be the newsreader with Peter Snow and John Chuser and Dawn McCormick. So it's kind of big promotion. And I got quite a lot of people writing to me, and one of them was a letter from Miriam Walker saying, "Are you one of my pookses?" I remember a Bridget Kendall. So I was back in touch with her, so that was lovely. But I mean, she taught me to read, you know, at a very young age.
Very young.
Yeah. So she's the main one I remember from those very early years.
So when you came to Cambridge, where did you live? Did you live in...
We lived in Barrow Road, which is my parents' the house at the end of the road. Very nice, because at the back of the garden it went onto a field. So those days there was a gate and a bridge, and we'd just go out into the field, so that was like an extension of our garden. It was wonderful. I remember lying on my stomach in the field with my father's old Flora book, one of those green backed with beautiful illustrations, working out what all the wildflowers were. And I still know my wildflowers. When I go for a walk, I name them as I go. And you know, I learnt that as a very small child with this book in this field. And in those days, Barrow Road was quite quiet. The road, I think, still belongs to Trinity. They have these lamps, which are still gaslit, and beautiful cherry trees. And there weren't that many cars. Most of the people didn't know were academics. Not everyone had a car. And there were quite a lot of children. Roy Khan's children, for example. And we used to play hopscotch on the road if there were so few cars. Chalk it out and play hopscotch. Where you couldn't do that now. Yeah.
It wouldn't last for long. So moving on to the purse, you were what, 11, 12?
Well, I was 7 when I first went there. I was extremely shy. I think we'd moved a lot. We'd moved so Oxford, and then the year at the Fawcett, I think, made me retreat into myself a lot. And when my parents died, I found, the way, that these things get kept, and these were my form reports. And it said, Bridget is a very quiet member of the form. Yeah. So I drew a lot, and I did okay, but I was not, not the kind of star pupil or anything. I was sort of somewhere in the middle. And somewhere around the age of 9, I remember thinking, I think I feel more confident. Came out of myself a bit, and felt better about school and being sociable. And then went on to the senior school at the Pass.
Was it a good school?
It was a very good school. It was a girls' school.
Mm.
It's pretty academic. It suited me because one of the things it was good at was music. I started learning the piano, and then the violin, and migrated to the viola. Music, through my teen years, it was really important to me. And school choir. And they had a great arts centre. Spent a lot of time there. And I could also, it was good at languages, so we all did French, and then everyone did Latin. And in those days, at that school, you could specialise early. So I did a year of physics and chemistry, and then gave it up to do intensive Russian, which, was something which was to shape my life from then on.
It's rather unusual for a school to offer Russian.
There weren't so many. I don't know if there's anywhere else in Cambridge. My first teacher was Mr. Burns. He had taught at Oundle. In fact, he was the classics master, and I think his knowledge of Russian, I'm not sure where it came from, possibly military service, but he taught it as though it was Greek or Latin, from the book. He didn't really speak it very much. And then when I was 16, he retired, and the new Russian teacher was a Russian émigré, Vera Geisen. She was quite well known in Cambridge. I don't know if you ever came across her. Effervescent, bubbly, lovely woman. And she taught me to speak Russian. I loved the subject from the start. I liked languages. I'd loved Latin a lot too. And, Russian's quite complicated, and I lapped that up. And then Mrs. Geisen just helped because she turned it into a living language for me. So that was all very important. The other thing at school that I did a lot of was drama. To begin with, we did plays. Every May we would have a competition between different houses in the school. I think there were 4. And we would put on a play, and I would usually be in the play. I remember I was the front end of Eeyore. We did Winnie the Pooh. And then, when I was about 14, what's now Hills Road Sixth Form College, but was then the County Boys, sent a message to the school via one of the teachers to say they were putting on a play and they needed some girls. So I went along to audition, and also to ask if I could help with props and scenery. And it was the Royal Hunt of the Sun of Peter Shaffer's play. Quite ambitious for a school, but they had a very talented drama teacher who was very ambitious for them. And so I did that, and I absolutely loved it. And you asked if the Perth Girls was a good school. It was, but it was very much a girls' school. It was, our headmistress used to chide us if we went out without our straw boaters on in the summer, letting the school down. And we were told not to eat sweets in school uniform. It was a very cosseted environment in that way, whereas the County Boys was much more life as it is, and much more edgy, especially the sort of drama they did. And so from then on, I would go there to collaborate with them and take part in things that they were putting on. They had a drama store, and we used to put on plays without any kind of adult supervision. And very often I would help with costumes, sometimes act. We did one Yeats play, which I wrote the music for, I found it the other day actually. I had to go and find out about pentatonic scales because Yeats has been very interested in Japanese music, and so I'd written it all in my nearest approximation to a pentatonic scale. It's kind of nice to listen to it all and think, well, wow, I was only 15 when I did that, and it's quite nice actually. So I was doing a lot of drama, and by now I changed piano teacher, and very much like my new piano teacher is a woman called Benina Lehman, who lived, her husband I think was a quite well-known haematologist, and they lived near us, and she was incredibly encouraging, and I became quite proficient at the piano and did all the exams, and by now I'd switched to the viola and would take part in the holiday orchestras that were run in Cambridge. Absolutely brilliant holiday orchestras, started by Ludwig Kennedy, who was the music advisor to the local education authority, and Molly Gilmore, and that was fantastic. I mean, I still now, listening to music in the car, I'll say to my partner, Tchaikovsky's Fifth or Brahms' Fourth or variations on a theme by Thomas Tallis. That's how I used to play that when I was a teenager. We had a whole repertoire. I think it's wonderful. It'd be wonderful if there were more opportunities for children to learn instruments and play in orchestras at a very early age, because you learn the music and it never leaves you. You know it so well all your life. Yeah. So lots of music, lots of drama. I joined a recorder consort to play all the recorders, because I played the viola. I could transpose clef very easily, and so yeah, I had a lot of drama and music in my life. And then at school was doing, languages and other, very much in the humanities sphere. Yeah.
Certainly in my case, and often in schools around the age of 15, if you happen to be an Anglican, you are confirmed into the Church of England, and even if you're not an Anglican, that often age between about 14, 15 and 20 is the time when you are often most religiously awake, so to speak, and I certainly was. I was an evangelical Christian of some kind. Did you go through that, or what is your religious?
My father was a very serious Anglican. His parents had been Methodist, but he would go to the parish church in Trumpington. My mother was not. She had studied philosophy at university, and she decided that she didn't believe in God, but she kind of believed in the principles of Christianity, but she wouldn't go to church on principle. But I think probably partly, but my brother wanted to get confirmed, and partly to please my father, I got confirmed at Trumpington Church. And then my older brother got involved in the church youth group at the Round Church, which in those days was the big evangelical church in Cambridge. And he got very, very involved in it. I went for a bit, but I got a bit kind of bored, and I was busy doing plays and doing music, and it didn't really hold too much appeal for me, and I floated away from all of that. To be honest, I didn't really like the way in the Bible, particularly St. Paul talked about women, and that put me off. So, but my older brother remains, and always has been, a very serious Christian. He's just qualified as a lay preacher, actually, in his retirement. And the younger four, initially, they all went with him. I think now 2 of them are still quite religious. I'm not sure about the other 2.
What would you say your present thoughts are on that subject?
Well, if I'm asked to fill in a form, I put C of E. And I very much enjoyed at Peterhouse going to evensong on Sunday evenings. I think if there hadn't been any music, I wouldn't have enjoyed it so much. Music was very much part of it. And if I'm in Cambridge and can, I will try to go to I'd have gone today to King's, but it's 3 o'clock, so I can't.
Sorry about that.
But in fact, just before I left Cambridge, I got ill, and we were here, and I was convalescing. for a few months after I was master. And I said to Amanda, let's just try and go to different evensongs at the different colleges and see what we think. So we'd come to King's quite a lot, but and of course we'd go to Peterhouse now and again. We thought Clare was very good. Not surprising really, because they'd had John Rutter as their music director for many years. Of course Trinity and St John's good, and Jesus.
Yeah, I interviewed John Rutter in my house. So you specialised in languages, and then is that what you took your A levels in?
Yes, I did French and Russian and English and art.
Four,
yeah. And did very well, and applied to Oxford. I didn't want to go to Cambridge, too close to my mother. I had been thinking I would do 7th term entry, but my father sat me down and said, I think you're ready. You know, I've got research students, and I think talking to you is like talking to one of them. I think you're ready for university. You should apply now, before A levels. And he also said, and as I was humming and hawing over what subject to do, I liked English a lot. He said, think about Russian, because it'll be an unusual subject, and when it comes to job applications, and people see that you know Russian, they'll probably give you a second glance. So it would be, you know, it might open doors for you. And boy, was he right. It was incredibly good advice. Yeah. So, yeah.
So you did, you went to Oxford?
Went to Oxford.
And did Russian?
And did Russian, yes. Well, you start off doing Russian and French, but unlike Cambridge, you prelims after 2 terms, and then you can drop one language if you want. And by then, there had been a former student at the Perse who'd come back, Jane Schoenberg. Her father, David Schoenberg, was a physicist here. He worked at Cavendish. And she'd been at the Perse, and she'd done Russian at the Perse, and then gone on to do it at university. And she'd got a British Council scholarship to spend her year abroad in the Soviet Union. And so she'd come back to her old school to give a talk about this. And I just listened enraptured, and I said to myself, that's what I'm going to do. So the plan of doing French and Russian at A level was because you needed 2 languages to apply to, I knew I wanted to apply to Oxford to do languages there, but always with an idea that probably I'd drop the French after 2 terms. To be honest, the books we were studying, there was Racine and Molière and some early French poetry. I didn't find it nearly as exciting as the Russian syllabus, which was Pushkin and Dostoevsky and Chekhov. And, you know, I just think Russian literature is hard to beat. But one of the reasons I wanted to drop the French was because at the end of in my 2nd year, I wanted to apply for this British Council scholarship to spend my 3rd year abroad, and I knew there weren't very many places. And I reckoned, through having talked to people, that I'd stand a better chance if I was just doing Russian. So I applied for this British Council scholarship because although I spoke not bad Russian, having been schooled by Mrs. Geisen, I didn't think it was good enough, and I was desperate to understand what it would be like to speak another language without translating it in your head. Just to, I knew I could never be bilingual, but I wanted to have that psychological experience of speaking a language that well. So I was desperate to get to Russia, and my tutor was very helpful and gave me a good reference. And I can always remember the day I went up to London to Spring Gardens, which was the British Council headquarters, just pausing at the door before I went in, looking out towards St James's Park, thinking this day could change my life. And went in and did the interview, and came out. And when the results came through, they said they'd had 12 places and I was 13th, so I didn't get it. So I was devastated, of course. My tutor had helped find some money, because of course we had no money, we had 6 kids at home on an academic salary. My tutor helped find some pot of money to enable me to go on a month's course to Russia that early summer. And then I set about starting to revise for the honours exams, finals that would be the following summer.
What year was that?
So that was the end of my second year. So that would be I went up in 74, so that was 76. So there I was revising away. A bit sad, but what can you do? And then they had said to me at the British Council, people do drop out, so don't give up on it. And sure enough, at the end of September, so like a week before I was due to go back to Oxford, they called up and said, someone's dropped out. Do you still want to go? Of course I did. It took another month to get my visa. And I remember setting off. I had a trunk, an old-fashioned trunk. Because the thing about the Soviet Union in those days was, and we were going to the provinces, a town called Voronezh, was that the shops had so many shortages that all sorts of ordinary things you had to take with you for 10 months. So I had vitamin pills and iron pills because food was problematic. I had aspirins. I had needle and thread. You needed sanitary products. Russians didn't have them. So you didn't need a whole trunk. And I remember going up to London to get the train at Fenchurch Street Station to Harwich, where we got on a ferry. There were 3 of us who were arriving late, me and a boy and another girl. Crossed over to Hook of Holland, where we got a train, and then went by train all the way to Moscow. So it was across Holland, Belgium, in Germany, Berlin, where you weren't allowed to get off the train, of course, first west, and then east Germany, and then all the way across through Poland and Warsaw, till you reached Brest-Litovsk on the border. And there at 4 a.m, the train stopped for 4 hours while they changed the wheels, because the Russians had a wider gauge than they still do than the Europeans, in order to stop any invasion by rail. So you had to wait for the wheels to be put on, and then on you went and into Moscow. So it was November, it's very snowy. That wide gauge is still there. It's been a huge problem for the Ukrainians when they couldn't get any grain out through the Black Sea and they wanted to send it overland via Poland and Romania. When they reached the border, they had to change the wheels on the trains. So not easy to change the gauge once you've put in one size. So then we arrived in Moscow, changed trains to take the train down to Voronezh, and there on the snowy platform was one of my fellow students from Oxford waiting to see us. It felt such an adventure. Yeah.
What are your, fairly briefly, but what are your chief memories and impressions of that first visit?
Of that visit in Voronezh? Well, it was very provincial. There's 1 million people in the town, and it's quite industrial. They made aeroplanes, and they had a nuclear power station, and lots of Russian cities created their own, food, certainly big bakeries and so on. It had been razed to the ground more or less by the Germans during the Second World War, and they'd rebuilt it exactly as it had been before, roughly, but with lots of high-rise blocks around. So it's a fairly grim, typical Russian provincial city. And the distribution list for goods in the Soviet Union worked like this. So Moscow was top of the tree and would have most of everything. And then Leningrad, as it used to be, and then the capitals of the republics, so Tbilisi and Kiev and so on. And then special military towns where they would provide them. And then by the time you got to provincial towns like Voronezh, there wasn't much of anything. So there really was, if you went into the butcher shop, they would sell sausage meat and salami. There was no meat. You couldn't get any fish. Even at the private markets where peasants could sell their goods, there really wasn't any meat or fish. You could just about get a scrawny chicken. So we had a fairly vegetarian diet. You could get cheese, and you could get salami and eggs and dairy products. There's always lots of baked goods. Vegetables, in the vegetable shop, you could get potatoes and onions and cabbage and apples and beetroots, carrots. But I remember we were invited up to Moscow for Christmas to stay with members of the British Embassy. There were about 6 of us from the UK, maybe 8, billeted with different families, and I stayed on a bit because I had some Russian friends who were able to arrange an extension for me. And when I got back to Voronezh at the end of January and went to the vegetable shop, there were potatoes, an onion, and pickled garlic, and pickled cabbage, and that was it. There was no other vegetable until the end of April. My mother used to send me dried soup packets. But you had to be inventive. So that was a major part of our lives, was just trying to feed ourselves. The whole place was very monochrome. It was very grey. And I hadn't realised, of course, I'd been brought up in Oxford and Cambridge, and I had not appreciated what a beautiful world I'd been brought up in. This was in stark contrast. If I'd been in an industrial town in Britain, maybe it wouldn't have been quite such a stark contrast. But one of the things that was really noticeable to me was that in the West, if you're going down a street, you've only been down once and want to find your way again. I hadn't realised you do orientate yourself on, there's a Clark's shoe shop and that's where the Boots is, and I turn left by the Boots. In a town like Voronezh, you didn't have any notices like that. You would have ovoshi, vegetables, or produkty, groceries, or syr, cheese. But you wouldn't, they were all state shops and there was no advertising. The only slogans there were on the buildings were the ones saying glory to Lenin and glory to communism and so on and so forth in big red lights on the tops of buildings. So I used to get lost all the time because I could never, one corner or one square looked much like another until you start to look at things in a different way. And it did teach me that year to look at things in a different way. And one of the more humbling lessons I got was that we lived in a hostel which had been allocated for foreign students and Russians, loyal Russians who would live with them. So I was in one room. It was probably about twice the size of your room here. And it had 4 of us in it, and me and another English girl and 2 Russians, who were, of course, spying on us, reporting on us. That was what they did for the privilege of having a slightly nicer room with foreigners. And so there were, I think, 4 floors. The ground floor was men, then a floor for girls, then men, girls. On the ground floor there was one shower room, which had 8 showers in it, but only 8 of them worked. And one morning it would be on for 3 hours and the boys could use it, and the girls in the evening for 3 hours, and the next day vice versa. It was the only place to wash. The loos were unspeakable. They were so filthy. There were no cleaning products or Vim or anything like that to clean anything. They turned off in the kitchen, which was also unspeakably filthy. They had turned off the oven because one girl had once tried to gas herself. So there were hobs, but that was it. But mainly, I didn't try and cook there because it was all so filthy. So you'd find places in the town cafes where sometimes you could get food, and we eat, bread and butter and cheese, and make simple soups in the room and so on. But the lesson I learned was that there were all these Russian students in among us, and very soon you realised who were the kind of creepy ones. And you'd steer clear of them. But then there was another category who were somehow very friendly and even quite outspoken in their criticism of the Soviet authorities. But after a while I began to realise that sometimes they were licensed to be critical in order to draw us out. And one of the ways that you could tell who were the privileged ones who you should watch out for because their parents probably had party or KGB connections was if they were nicely dressed and might have, things which came from abroad. And I realised that actually it was the sort of shabbier, grubbier people who were the ones who you should be friends with. And, I'd come from this world, I did a lot of theatre and art and everything, and I'd always been very interested in choices people made about clothes and how they looked, and it was probably a little bit judgmental. That year in Russia taught me what a kind of snob I'd been, really, and that you shouldn't look skin deep, you should look deeper, and you could even be quite badly misguided in a place like that by what someone appeared like on the surface. It taught me a lot about looking beneath the surface. It was very useful later when I was a journalist.
What was your general impression of the Russians you met? Were you
Of the Russians
you met, both
Russians
in the
I
hostel
met.
and us? I mean, did you warm to them and like them, or did you?
Yes, I mean, I was very lucky to have a connection with a family in Moscow who actually are closely connected to Cambridge. Peter Kapitsa,
Oh, yeah,
who was
famous.
at Cavendish
Yeah,
and worked
very
with
famous. The
Rutherford.
crocodile.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he went back to Russia to see his aged mother in the 1930s, and Stalin insisted he stayed.
Yeah.
So his wife and two small boys, who were like English schoolboys, and their English nanny went back to the Soviet Union and stayed on there. And he eventually, I mean, he had a difficult time after the war when he refused to work on the Soviet bomb and was exiled from Moscow, but was rehabilitated by Khrushchev, and was a grand old man at the academy. And in the I think in the late 60s, he and his wife were eventually allowed back for a short visit to Cambridge. And in the mid 70s, they came again, and they brought their granddaughter Masha, who was in her early 20s, just finished Moscow University in the psychology department. And so they were invited back by Trinity, I think he was an honorary fellow. And they were having dinner in Churchill College, which is just across the road from their old house. Churchill was managing the house for them, still there on Huntington Road. And they happened to sit next to my father, who was dining that night. And he said, "I think I know who you are. Aren't you academician Kapitsa?" Because my father had worked with Cockcroft during the war, who was the first master of Churchill, who had known Kapitsa from the Rutherford days. So Kapitsa was very pleased to be recognised. And he invited them back to tea. And he said, "You must come to tea because you must meet my daughter, because she's waiting for a visa to go to Russia." And that was me. And Masha was roughly my age. So she became a good friend. And they said, "When you come to Moscow, you must let us know." And they were actually a wonderful boon for me, because he had huge clout. And they were able to arrange for me to stay on in Moscow for Christmas. And one of them was going to visit friends in the Caucasus, and they said, "Oh, Bridget, you must come too. You must see Georgia." And so, normally the KGB and Voronezh would not let you do anything. They didn't have foreign students roaming around the country. But with a letter from Peter Kapitsa, they gave me the visa. So they gave me a lot more leeway. And I saw a lot of them when I'd go up to Moscow for a week or two and see them. So I had a kind of escape valve, which was good, really. Because Voronezh was a very closed world. And I did like some of the Russians very much. And I joined a drama club, and I took up life drawing. And someone introduced me to a girl who was doing English literature, who was lovely. Everyone was a little careful how they spoke to me. And I only realised later, the girl doing English literature, who I remained friends with after the Soviet Union fell apart, she and her husband said, "We never felt we could talk frankly to you, not because we didn't trust you, but we were never sure in your naivety who you might report the conversation to who would get us into trouble." So you see, the system of fear worked in a very insidious way, which is the way it's probably working today. So one of the big things that struck me was how a lot of these people were very educated, and essentially Europeans like you or I, but caught up in this awful system, which is not their fault. So I felt very sorry for them. And of course, it meant that when I went back as Moscow correspondent to report on the collapse of the Soviet Union, I could kind of share in their exhilaration at getting rid of it all.
That leaps over some years, because after you finished at Oxford, there were a few years before you became a journalist and so on. What did you do in that period?
So that year in Voronezh, before that I had thought that probably I would finish my degree and maybe I would go into costumes in the theatre. But that year in Russia made me think, this is too interesting. My Russian's getting quite good, but it's not good enough. And there's all this literature and this whole world that now I'm learning about politically, which before I knew more about. And I happened to meet the friend of a friend who was doing a PhD in Leningrad. And I kind of looked at her life and I thought, I'd love to do that. So I came back to Oxford and said to my tutor, I kind of think I'd like to do research. Of course, she was delighted. And then I started doing tutorials at St Anthony's with Max Hayward, who was a former diplomat and wonderful expert on Soviet literature. And I realised that was the area that I really was fascinated by, because it was an intersection of literature and politics. And I went back to my tutor and said, this is what I want to focus on, but I think I need to be more educated about politics and history. I only know really about literature and language. So I want to apply to a scholarship in the States to see if I can get a year or two there to fill in before I come back to St Anthony's. And so I was lucky enough to get a Harkness Fellowship and went to Harvard for 2 years, where I did indeed fill in the blanks. It was great.
It was a good experience.
It was. I mean, I did actually find I wasn't sold on the Harvard education experience. It's a place that's very focused on productivity. They have a law school and a government school and a medical school, and they're used to sort of churning out people who will have these sort of credits that line up to their qualification. And I think that the graduate students in the School of Arts and Sciences were seen a bit as poor relations who were never going to bring back large donations. And their work wasn't quite so kind of obviously useful. Although a lot of them joined the administration often, or the CIA, who were studying Russian stuff. So I don't know why I had that feeling, but I did. But it was good for me to go to America.
Did you like America generally?
I tended to feel that I had more affinity with the Russians I'd met in Russia than the Americans I met. But I did go back again to be correspondent. I was sort of fascinated by it, but I knew I'd never live there permanently. But I understood that it was a place that I needed to crack. But I came back to St Anthony's to start a DPhil and then applied to Moscow again to spend a year in the archives. So I went and spent another year in Moscow, which is the year just before Brezhnev died. So things had moved on since I'd been there before.
This is about
1981 to 82. And there was a feeling of fin de siècle. And who knows what will happen next, the edge of a precipice, because people knew Brezhnev was going to die soon. The father of a friend took me out for a walk once and said, we don't know what will happen when he goes, but it could be terrible. We could be going back to the 1930s and the terror. And you need to try and stay in touch with the younger generation, you young people, because we could be cut off from the West. Well, it didn't happen then. Instead, we had perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But ironically, it's happened now. They are cut off again. So these things can be cyclical. Anyway, he was wrong at that point, because although Brezhnev was followed by Chernyenko and then Andropov and then Chernyenko, then came Gorbachev, and that opened the floodgates. But I came back from that year in Moscow feeling my Russian was pretty good. And I also felt I'd met a lot of people. I'd made a point of trying to network with as many people as I could, mainly to try and find people who'd known the author I was working on. He was a man called Platonov, a rather interesting writer who wrote in a rather unusual style. Wasn't very well known in the West. Who only died in 1953, so it was quite possible to meet people who'd known him. And in the process of this huge network, I felt I did have a sense of how the society worked. And I came back and thought, now what? Okay, if I finish my thesis, what sort of job am I going to get? There aren't very many jobs in universities doing Russian. And the father of a friend of mine said, you should apply to the BBC. They need people who know about Russia. So that's what I did. So that's how I joined the BBC.
1983.
Yeah.
And tell us about your... Would you like
a glass of water would be lovely.
A glass of water. But would you like a couple of minutes break? Or are you
No, I'm okay. I'll just have something to drink.
Okay. Tell us about your experience of going to the BBC.
Well, I applied. There were graduate training schemes. There were 3. There was television production, there was news journalism, and there was a general traineeship, which was supposed to be sort of fast track into management. And I thought, well, okay, I edited the school magazine. I haven't really done any journalism. Although I had been a reporter on Radio Oxford for a while, but I kind of didn't rate that because I hadn't, done varsity and Charwell and all that kind of stuff. So I thought, well, there's no point in me applying for that. It'll be full of people who've got journalism experience, so I'll apply to the other 2. So I hired a colour television and bought the Radio Times every week and set about studying the BBC, which paid off because they called me to interview for both schemes, and then called me back to the final selection. So I think they had about 10 or a dozen people and 6 places on each scheme. So I got to the final in each. And then both of them turned me down on the grounds that I was too old. I was 26. So again, I was gutted. Because I'd invested a lot in that and it hadn't worked. But then I then had 2 letters in the post. One was from the head of documentaries, TV documentaries, who had been on the TV production board, to say, we're planning a big documentary series on Russia and we'd like to talk to you about possibly being a researcher. And the other was from the head of the external services, as it was called then, latterly the World Service, a man called Austin Kark, who had been on the board for the general traineeship. And he said, I thought we should have given it to you, but I didn't manage to get my way, so I found some money to give you a traineeship at the World Service. So I went to the World Service. And it was a good place to start. International journalism, which was then always my thing. Although, when I arrived, I was horrified to be put on a daily news programme because I felt I didn't know enough about the world. And, the World Service will be covering elections in Turkey and Indonesian economy, and, you're on the night shift, Bridget, and you have to interview the finance minister from Nigeria. What did I know about any of this? So for about 2 or 3 weeks, I barely slept, just tried to mug up on everything. But after a while, I realised I really loved it. I loved the immediacy of it, so different from the academic world. And really took to it. Yeah. And then after a while, when, as Russia became more important, more possible to report on, they would keep coming to me saying, oh, Bridget, Russian, go to that super person, go to Reykjavik, the Reykjavik summit, see if you can find some Russians to interview. Could you go to Russia and do some documentaries for the radio? And eventually, in 1989, I was doing it. Sometimes I would come back and say, Bridget, Reagan's going to Moscow, go and help with the coverage. And I remember coming back and saying to my editor, the Reagan visit was all right, but that's not the really interesting thing that's going on. What's really interesting is that Gorbachev's called a special party conference to consider the role of the Communist Party. I need to go back. And he was great. He said, yes, go. Go. So I was there a lot. And then eventually the foreign editor of the radio said we were planning to expand the bureau. And would you apply for the job? So I did. And in July 1989, went back as Moscow correspondent. Yeah. Just in time.
Just in time. A friend of mine, I was running the Department of Social Anthropology for my professor, who was called Ernest Gellner.
Oh, yes.
And Ernest was in the Soviet Union at that time. I remember him telling me, I think, that no one foresaw what was going to happen.
No. When I went out in July 89, of course I was tracking it all closely, and already there were the beginnings of stirring in the press of right-wing backlash. there was a woman called Nina Andreeva who wrote a letter for one of the communist newspapers, basically lambasting perestroika. And the point of it was the letter had got published, so we knew there was a faction in the Communist Party that was behind this. And meanwhile, there were other people who were impatient with Gorbachev. Sakharov was one, for not going fast enough and far enough. And so the whole thing was getting more fraught. I sometimes get asked now, oh, you were in Moscow when the Berlin Wall came down. What was it like in Moscow? And I say, well, actually it was 10 o'clock at night when the first chips in the Berlin Wall happened, and it was 1 a.m. in Moscow, so nobody reacted immediately. This is pre-internet and pre-rolling news. And secondly, even the following morning, there was a muted response because everyone was completely wrapped up with what was happening in Moscow. There was a special congress that Gorbachev had invented. Sakharov was a delegate, as was Yeltsin, and delegations from the Baltics and Georgia who were wreaking havoc, challenging the Communist Party. It was extraordinary. And of course, it was important what happened in Eastern Europe. But we knew that none of it was possible without what was happening in Moscow. So we were gripped by the Moscow drama far more than we were by the Eastern European one. Although it's a chicken and egg, would one have happened without the other? So, but when I first arrived in July 1989, I remember thinking, because of this, being aware of this beginnings of a backlash, I was thinking, am I going to have the very difficult job of managing Western audiences' expectation that all this is going to unravel the way it is in Eastern Europe? But actually, Gorbachev is going to face more and more problems, and the lid will come back down, and it will retreat. People won't be used to sort of shifting gear in that way. And I wasn't wrong. Gorbachev did have to retreat to survive, and the backlash against reform became greater. But what I didn't anticipate was that it would reach this crescendo in 1991, where it was irresolvable, and there was this attempted coup which failed. And then in response to that, really, Yeltsin and the President of Ukraine and Prime Minister of Belarus decided to dismantle the whole thing. None of us saw that coming. I remember so after this attempted coup, and we didn't see the attempted coup coming either. That was August the 19th, 1991. Gorbachev had gone off on holiday. It was a sleepy August. Everyone had left, like they do in France, gone off to their Dutchess. I remember I had plans to play tennis that morning. And I was rung by the BBC, and they said there's a very strange announcement on TASS about a state of emergency and Gorbachev being ill. Go to the office and find out about it. And to begin with, I wasn't sure whether it was just a declaration, but not real. But then I turned on the television, and the old Soviet newsreader who'd been sacked by Gorbachev was back. And then they played Swan Lake, which they always do in a crisis. And then someone rang me from the other side of Moscow to say there were tanks coming down the street. And we realised it was a real attempted coup. But because Yeltsin defied it, it only lasted 3 days. So that was the most extraordinary cataclysm. You couldn't have made it up. It was like some sort of thriller that you were in the middle of. But in the wake of it, Gorbachev was a depleted figure. Yeltsin was the name of the day. We didn't know they were planning this breakup. And it wasn't really, it wasn't until it happened that it sort of dawned on us that the Soviet Union was really going to disappear. It was, an extraordinary coda to what had been an extraordinary summer. Yeah.
What was the part of America in that whole?
Well, interestingly, George H. Bush, who was rather slow to make his number with Gorbachev. I think Reagan was quite won over by Gorbachev. And Schultz who was his Secretary of State, had worked very hard with Gorbachev, actually to educate him in Western economics, which he knew nothing about. Schultz once told me in an interview that he would bring he would pack his cards for his economics seminar for postgraduates in Stanford. I think he was at Stanford, and bring them to the Kremlin so they'd be preparing the latest summit. And Gorbachev would say, exactly how do market forces work? And he'd say, well, let me show you this thing. And basically give him a seminar on international economics. So that's one role the Americans played. But when Reagan was replaced by George H. Bush, he was a bit wary. He was worried that Reagan had gone a bit soft on the commies. And there was quite a long time before he arranged a summit with Gorbachev. But they did then forge a good relationship. And we know from memoirs and papers that have been made public that there were messages at the beginning of '91 when, through the American ambassador, Jack Matlock, Gorbachev was sending messages saying, I'm going to have to zig and to zag, but hold with me. I'm just doing this to keep him in power. And what did become obvious was that after all these superpower summits to cut back on nuclear weapons, the Americans were very invested in the Soviet leader. In Gorbachev, yes, but also in the Soviet Union. And they didn't want to break up, because what would happen to the nuclear weapons and what would happen to all the treaties they'd signed? So in July 1991, he came on a visit to George H. Bush, came on a visit to Moscow. Yeltsin tried to muscle in, and the Americans were a bit cross about that. Yeltsin, by then the Russian president, which was a constituent part of the Soviet Union, but lower in tier than Gorbachev as overall president. And then Bush went to Kiev, where he gave what's known as his chicken Kiev speech, when he said to the Ukrainians, don't leave the Soviet Union. You shouldn't do that. That would be very destabilizing, which they didn't want to hear, of course. They wanted to, they were already thinking they wanted to get back their sovereignty. So it's interesting, although subsequently Putin and people close to him have blamed the Americans for the breakup of the Soviet Union, it wasn't like that at the time. That was not what was happening.
Well, another story I've heard is that when Poland became an independent economy, a friend of mine, Jeff Sachs, was advising them on how they should become capitalists in quite a severe way, but it worked because he managed to get quite a lot of support from the US. Mm-hmm. They paused the debts and then lent the money. And Jeff was with the delegation from the Soviet Union or Russia that went to America asking for the same treatment.
Yeah.
And he described to me how the foreign minister and the economics minister came out of the meeting with the World Bank and IMF white-faced because they've been told, no, we're not going to help you at all. And he later asked Kissinger, that is Jeff, why did you do that? And 2 years later, and he said, well, when your enemy is down and weak and you don't want them to rise again, you kick them.
Well, that might be Kissinger's view. I did talk to John Major about this. John Major was hosting a G7 summit in July 1991, right? So about the time of George H. Bush's visit, before the coup. And Gorbachev was invited, or he came over before the summit to ask John Major, as host of the G7 summit, if G7 would give help to him, to help him survive. And what John Major said was, we were in a mini recession at that time. If you think back to 91, George H. Bush was just about to lose the next election on the back of that mini recession. And they just didn't have the amount of money that would be needed for a country the size of Russia to really help it. So I guess there are more than one answers to that. Maybe Kissinger had one. I don't think, that wasn't the answer I heard from John Major.
Interesting. So moving on from then, how long do you stay on the Russian desk?
I remained Moscow correspondent through, into the new Russia. which was also full of dramas. 92, 93, Yeltsin bombing his own parliament. And was supposed to leave 93, but I went back in 94 to make a long film for Panorama about a new...
You went back to make a documentary?
Yes, I went back to make a documentary about a new politician who'd done very well in parliamentary elections, called Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was a very far-right, flamboyant figure, and he got about 25% of the vote, so that was a bit shocking. So it was a film about the Russian popular backlash to the end of the Soviet Union and the reforms, and the kind of shock therapy that Jeffrey Sachs was referring to. So that was very interesting to go around the country and see what was happening. I remember going to Sevastopol. They still had all the Soviet slogans and statues up, very Soviet city. And there was the Black Sea Fleet, and the sailors would come out on the deck in the morning and swab it down, do all their business, raise the flags. And there'd be one or two little Ukrainian ships raising the Ukrainian flags. But what we found out from talking to people was that they didn't go out of the port at all because they didn't have any fuel. Yeah, that was the extent of the problems that they had at that time. So they had a fleet with no fuel. So after I'd made that documentary, I moved to Washington as Washington correspondent. I felt I needed to get away from the Soviet and post-Soviet world, because it's so absorbing and so gripping and so many things happening that you didn't have an attention span to think about anywhere else in the world. And I felt I was losing perspective. And I thought it'd be good to go to Washington to see how the former superpower was managing now its enemy had disappeared. So I was there 94 to the end of 98, so almost 5 years. Yeah. And then came back to London. I was invited to come back as diplomatic correspondent.
And what was your feeling of your time those 4 years?
In the States? Well, unlike my earlier time when I'd been in Harvard, I was now doing a lot of beltway politics. So I was accredited to the White House. I travelled with Clinton a lot. So I was doing a lot of the internal politics in White House and on the Hill. But I did travel a lot around the US. There was a lot of, actually now you could sort of see it as the sort of nascent world which became MAGA. But there was a lot of internal trouble, of very small scale terrorism going on. Oklahoma City bombings, I don't know if you remember them, they blew up, this young man blew up, a disaffected soldier blew up a federal building. And so I did quite, especially for radio, I did a lot of reporting from out in the sticks to try and understand all this. It was very much below the radar, but very much a trend that, as we now know, we wondered if it was the sort of swish of the dragon's tail before it dies, but it wasn't actually. It was a movement which was, as it turns out, to grow. Yeah, so that was very, that was very striking. The other thing was on foreign policy, that America wrestling with itself about its position in the world, and whether or not it should intervene. And in fact, Clinton did. He intervened in Bosnia with the Dayton Accords, which was a success to ending the war in Bosnia. And then, as we know, just not long before he stepped down, he got involved in the Kosovo War with Blair, so these are sort of a little bit hard to sell to Americans, but he did successfully sell them to them. And then alongside that, in the final couple of years I was there was this whole parallel story about Clinton's sexual misdemeanors culminating in on Monica Lewinsky, which is another thing you couldn't have made up. He's just extraordinary.
Did you feel, I mean, people are very critical of American democracy, as it's called now. Did you feel at that time that it was a democracy in the proper sense of being answerable to the people?
Well, I think there's a fair amount of corruption. Frankly, there is everywhere. And how you measure one set of corruption against another, I don't know. I mean, some places in America were corrupt, some were not. I'm not sure Vermont is corrupt, for example. And there was a lot of community activity and voluntary work and citizen involvement and engagement, which I think is often passed over, which is perhaps now rather important in America. But there were ways in which it was sort of, you did sometimes think the first arrivals from Europe went to America because they were seen as extremists, and they're still extremists. There were a fair number of those. But in among them, of course, there were others who were not. And, if I think about members of Congress, there were some fantastic senators in Congress, men and women. And even in the White House, too, there was some, admirable politicians. So it wasn't all bad. But, that's different from the way the checks and balances are being tested now. I would never have predicted from those years that we would be in a world where America has swung quite apparently, given the Trump, not just Trump, but Congress having swung behind him, this world of America first and new intolerance and put me first sort of feeling. I thought then that it was moving in a progressive way and that this group of people would be increasingly beleaguered, the sort of far right, if you like, and eventually become inconsequential. How wrong was I? But I guess, we all look back over our lives and the history we've lived through, and maybe most of us would agree with that. I mean, I don't think anybody saw the rise of China when the rise of China happened. I don't think anybody, I remember in the late 1990s, we all thought Russia had just defaulted on its foreign debt and it had new loans due in 2005, and we didn't think it'd be able to meet them. In fact, because the oil price went up and because of one or two good economic reforms that in the early years Putin brought in, Russia turned itself around and it was, suddenly an energy superpower. So there are so many ways in which these things don't turn out the way you expect them to.
Just retrospective on the collapse of the Soviet Union, do you think the leaders could have managed it in a different way and more successfully?
I'm not sure. It comes back to your comments about Kissinger, really, because I think that, some of my Russian friends said this to me at the time. It's just too big a problem for someone outside to have solved. So, there couldn't have been a Marshall Plan that was big enough. You could manage it in Lithuania or the other Baltic states or Poland, as you're talking about. They're small. And they'd only been part of this communist system since the war. It hadn't got into people's DNA. This had been in Russia since 1917. And the way society was remade in the 1920s had a very profound effect on people. And you can't just efface 70 years of a system like that, however distorted and corrupt and dysfunctional. It nonetheless leaves its print on people, and it takes more than one generation for it to disappear or to be overcome. And I sort of feel the tragedy of Russia today is that it was making headway. Through the chaotic 90s it was making headway, and in the early Putin years it was making headway. There was a bigger middle class, people were travelling, they were understanding the world, they had the opportunity, which they never had in the Soviet Union, to make their own choices and to show ingenuity and creativity, and make something of their lives and be proud of themselves, and do things for their communities, and people reviving communities in rural areas which had been left and neglected through the Soviet period as well as the post-Soviet period. But now they've taken steps backward, and maybe some time before they can get over what they're living through now in order to try and re-engage and develop again.
So on that, I mean, what do you think lies behind the Ukraine war?
I think what lies behind it is, Putin's ostensible reason is that it was Ukraine's rapprochement with, or New Deal with the EU was encroachment of NATO by other means, and he wanted to stop it. And he felt Ukraine, his view, it should be part of the Russian world for historical and religious reasons, but also security reasons. That's the argument. But I think there's another argument, which is that he's become increasingly paranoid and ruthless about staying in control. And there were ways in which part of his world looked as though it could slip out of his control. And in Ukraine, it was successive protests against whatever Russia tried to do, starting with the Orange Revolution in 2003 to 4, protests against Russian gas maneuvers, and then the Maidan in 2014. And latterly, there were the huge protests in Belarus next door, feeling there'd been fraudulent elections. And at the same time, in the Far East, in Khabarovsk, there were weekly protests in Russia because he had arrested a governor accused of fraud who was not in his ruling party and was quite popular locally. So I remember looking that summer at the protests in Belarus, which went on, you'll remember, and these Khabarovsk protests that did not subside, thinking, what is Putin going to do? He cannot allow these things to continue because they send a message which is empowering to other people that maybe we can also protest. And there had been some environmental protests around Moscow, people objecting to some new plant being put up or water not being clean. Or there was the capacity for internal protest. There had been protests in 2011 against fraudulent elections, which ended up with calls for Putin to go. It very quickly spirals into Putin was going. So I wondered, what would he do? And guess what? The following year, he invaded Ukraine. Why? To make sure that Ukraine does not join the West and become another Poland, and then give the Russian people the idea that they could have that too. It's an excuse to crack down at home, which he's done. It's why he's let anyone who wanted to leave, as he put it, to spit the flies out of our mouths. He doesn't see it as the loss of their best IT people and best educated and the young generation who would help solve Russia's demographic problem. He sees them as a fifth column who are far too westernized, so best get rid of them because he wants total control. So he now has a country which, like the Soviet Union, there's a veneer of fear where you have to do what you're told. I don't think that'll change while he's in the Kremlin.
This is one former Soviet communist country. We mentioned no one foresaw the rise of China. Have you ever had any experience of China or had any thoughts about it?
I'm not an expert on China. I don't have the depth of knowledge there, so I think I'm probably not qualified to speak about it. And I haven't been there for a long time, so I don't know that I know. I don't feel I'm up to date.
Yes, I go every year, so I'm watching it quite carefully. Anyway, just to come back to Cambridge and your last role here, you became master of Peterhouse. Now, Peterhouse, as you know, is the oldest college and the smallest college and the most right-wing college, some people thought.
Once.
I had friends, I was a friend, well, a very junior friend of Hugh Trevor, and there were certainly some historians who were notoriously, shall we say, right of centre. But on the other hand, a friend of mine became the first female, certainly junior research fellow. She was Slovenian, Maja Petrovic, in Peterhouse. So they were changing quite fast. And Tony Wrigley was a friend of mine. He was a pretty liberal, middle of the road sort of person. But what was it like being a master, the first female master of a Cambridge college?
Well, I was very welcomed. I also had a female partner, so they welcomed her too, and we had a great time. I decided that I would, it's a 7-year fixed term, so I would put Peterhouse first. So all the other things I used to do, I stopped doing. Well, I had a weekly radio programme I had kept up, but if I was invited to travel during term time, I'd say, no, I need to be at Peterhouse. And I think that was a good thing to do, to get very involved in the college and the students, and everything that was happening. Paid off. I think people appreciated it. And, both my partner and I, maybe it was rather a radical departure to have a female master with a female partner, but we are both, we both like tradition a lot. So we enjoyed Candlelit Evensong and Latin Grace and all the traditions at Peterhouse that are upheld. We respect them and still enjoy them. And I think if it had a reputation once of being very Thatcherite, that's the reputation, that was another era, and those people retired, and not all of them, quite a lot of them are no longer with us, and new fellows came who brought with them a different ethos and different views. So I think it's a very different place now. And maybe sometimes it suffers from anyone who doesn't know it very well thinking, well, it's still very traditional, they behave in a very traditional way. Probably still is a very conservative college, but you can wear your traditions very lightly on your sleeve if you want. You don't need to be conservative with them. So it was a great experience. It was a huge privilege. I loved it.
Well, I was taken round by the former master, Adrian Dixon, and never been round inside of it properly, or the wonderful deer park and gardens, which are really beautiful. It's a fascinating and beautiful college.
Adrian was very helpful to me. He was my predecessor. Gave me a lot of help, as did many others in the college. Yeah. So I think it's a very happy place, and I think I was lucky to end up being master of a small college, because it meant I could get to know everybody and be quite involved. If you're in a much bigger institution, it's harder to do that.
So just a final 2 or 3 questions. One is, often I say to people who are in a particular field, who are physicists or anthropologists, what would be your advice to a young person going into your particular field? So in the case of journalism, what do you think would be your advice to someone thinking of being a journalist, and what makes a good journalist?
I think what makes a good journalist is being a good listener. Because your job is to try and draw other people out, not be the centre stage yourself. So often when I think about my colleagues who were foreign correspondents with me, the most effective ones, who wrote the best stories or did the best reports, were the very quiet ones, had good ideas, and not the the big actors who drew the lights to them. That's one thing. I think nowadays journalism is a bit different from when I started, and there's less money around, the technology is different, and basically you need to be able to turn your hand to most things, so you should be able to broadcast on the radio, do television reports, write a blog, edit, write well, be good on social media. So equip yourself with those skills now, before you apply. Anyone can set up a blog. You can set up a podcast with your friends. Understand how to edit on your iPhone or on your laptop. Learn how to do it. Get a portfolio together. And first of all, you'll first of all get the grounding, so that, you'll be a step ahead whenever you're asked to do something. Secondly, you'll find out what you like doing, and you may find to your surprise you thought you wanted to write, but actually you really love the radio. And the other thing is that that's all the craft. Those are the skills, the tools of the trade. But what makes a good journalist is what's in your head. And you want to try and acquire experience which will give you depth. And I think you do that by following your passion. Now in my case, and I think it's a good way to do it, putting yourself in a foreign environment and learning about yourself as well as the world around you is a very good way of giving yourself extra depth, I think. But you can do it by working in a care home in Britain, or taking a job in a car repair workshop where you're meeting people, sort of people you've never met before. But you have to, whatever you do, you have to try and do it well. And you'll only do it well if you really love doing it. So even if what you really love doing doesn't look as though it'll have a job at the end of it, do it anyway, because you'll do it well.
That's a very nice, optimistic and helpful note. Thank you very much indeed, Bridget.